Welcome to today's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast, your channel for super easy, no-nonsense advice on how to declutter and organise your home. Please welcome your hosts, professional organisers Ingrid Jansen and Leslie Spellman.
Hello and welcome listeners to episode 7 of the Declutter Hub podcast. I'm Leslie and I'm delighted to welcome good friend and colleague Jasmine Sleigh, who is going to give us some insight into the work she does with people who have a hoarding issue in their home. Ingrid and I work with Jasmine on the board of the Association of Professional Declutterers and Organisers, and she has since become a UK specialist and expert in hoarding. Jasmine owns Change Your Space, a professional organising business based in Devon. She spent the last 5 years working with local councils, social services, mental health teams and the fire service with clients who are living in dangerously full homes. She's worked with many people who have a pronounced hoarding issue in their homes, sorting their belongings and making spaces safer. Welcome, Jasmine.
Hi, Leslie. Thanks for having me.
Oh, you're very welcome. It's great to have you here. So, Jasmine, the aim of today's podcast is to try and explain to our listeners what traits a hoarder has compared to someone who is overwhelmed with stuff and disorganisation, because there's a very big difference. So you've done lots of work with both types of people. How do you actually know if someone is a hoarder?
I think that's a really important question because we see people at all ends of the spectrum when we're working. But there's a real giveaway for me, I think, when I'm speaking to somebody, whether they've got a very much more pronounced hoarding tendency or even perhaps hoarding disorder, rather than, simply perhaps being a bit overwhelmed with unresolved stuff. I can often even tell this on the telephone as the sort of first giveaway for me. Is that the person might have a really detailed explanation and a full rationale for why items in their home are there in the first place and cannot be moved. So kind of in the conversation, you get a real pronounced sense that they are stuck without any window to let some items go. There's an explanation for why every item there's going to be a problem with it being let go. And it just, you can get a sense that it's a more full-on compulsion that's running their thinking and has sort of integrated itself into the sense of who they are and their home.
So it's much more of a kind of permanent mindset that takes a lot of working through to resolve then?
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's, everyone's nervous if they're speaking to a professional organizer for the first time, but you can really tell if somebody is finding this hugely more problematic because they're suffering with a hoarding issue than somebody who's come to you because they've got stuff that they need to just sort out in their home. So I give an example. So last month I had a call from a lady. She was ready to make a change in her home. I mean, she was very brave picking up the phone in the first place. She spoke to me and she explained she hadn't got any central heating and was embarrassed to have the engineers round due to newspapers being stacked around in her home. So I asked her the question, what's holding you back from recycling most of those newspapers? I mean, we're very careful, and we don't say, why are you not chucking out the whole lot? We say, kindly, what's holding you back from recycling most of those newspapers? And she explained to me that she has to read every paper, that it would be wasteful, in her mind, it'd be wasteful not to have made sure she'd looked through each page. It wasn't going to be straightforward. So I suppose the next question for me is to ask her, okay, so how many papers are coming into your home per week? And she said to me, around 4. I buy 2 at the weekend and I get the 2 free papers that come through the door anyway. So in that conversation, you're getting a real sense that not only is the backlog filling her home so much that she's having personal problems, not only is she having to have an explanation of why they're all there and why they can't just go, but also she's got a compulsion that she still has to acquire papers.
Yeah, and I suppose for most of us that compulsion and that attachment to those newspapers, most of us would regard that as irrational, and that's the difference, isn't it, I guess? So that's an example that you've got of someone with newspapers, and that carries on through with other things in the home, I presume, as well. So things like clothes, books, food, even stationery, that kind of thing. So it can be any time, or it could be everything as well. So, it could be an attachment to everything in the home.
Absolutely. Sometimes it's a very specific type of item. So I've met people who have really strong attachments to certain types of things in their home, but other items you've got a bit more leeway with in terms of addressing, sorting, and potentially letting some items go. But you can go into homes where the anxiety around holding on to belongings has bled in, if you like, to every aspect of their home. So it can be anything, and it's anything where they've made a reason in their mind why the acquisition and non-disposal is so crucial to them. So that drawer is really powerful as well. As I've mentioned there, it can allow a person in that circumstance to swap daily comforts and safety that we take for granted in our homes for that, what I would call hoard to you, but I mean, obviously that's not what I call it to the client. So that hoard becomes so important to them that they will swap it for being comfortable in their home. So my clients with pronounced hoarding issues will often have no heating in their home. They're perhaps unable to have people and family over. They may not even be able to have carers over to look after their physical needs because there's nowhere for them to sit down and address their physical needs, for example. So they may not be having access to their bed or hot water, not able to boil the kettle and make a cup of tea, or they're putting themselves at considerable risk just moving around their home. It's really pronounced.
So what's happening really is that the stuff is becoming more important to them than their own well-being and sort of general health and, feeling good about their life really. And the stuff is sort of taking over, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's one of the real difficulties with hoarding that makes it so markedly different to working with somebody who's ready to make a change and is not so held back by that excruciating anxiety that hoarding has, which is that for them, it's personally more painful to address the hoard, the items they're stockpiling with that full rationale that won't allow them to let things go. It's more painful to address that than live with the sort of inconvenience of being without heat and water. Most of us, no matter how hard we find the decluttering process, would not make that swap. So that's why real hoarding is so rare. They reckon it affects, about between 2 and 5% of the population. But the impact on the person, their whole life, their family and environment can be considerable.
I just wanted to jump back to something that you just said before, Jasmine. You talked about that you wouldn't address it as a hoard to the hoarder, and that you would call it something differently. Do you think that's a really important thing, or do you think that the hoarder knows that they are? Are you trying to sort of brush over that? Why would you not call it a hoard?
I think I try and avoid the word hoarder and hoard because I think it then steps into a them and us situation. And obviously in working with somebody, I do want to be on their side. I want them to feel as if I understand where they are. And so starting to use that terminology it feels a bit judgmental. The only difference is when I'm working with people where, I might say, look, this looks like to me, a much more pronounced hoarding issue. Would you like me to help you phrase a letter for your GP, for example? Because some people are living in environments that, they're not getting the right support. And, sometimes it could be helpful to say, I think you need to acknowledge you do have this issue. It looks to me like you've got this issue. I'm not a psychologist. I can't make the diagnosis. But I would only use that terminology if we were seeking to get some of the support, and calling their belongings that they've invested themselves in so much a hoard does diminish it, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, and it's quite disrespectful then, I guess, when you're working with
yeah.
But I think for the purposes of this podcast, then it's quite important for us to distinguish between the two. And there's very blurred lines. There's there's no where that point crosses, and it can pull back and move around and so on. So it's really blurred lines, isn't it? I mean, I've always tried not to label anybody that I work with anything. It's all about what we can do for you in your circumstances. But sometimes it's important where that psychology kicks in to understand that there's going to be more needed than just a professional organizer in some instances.
Yeah, absolutely right. Yeah.
So once you've gone through that process, then we've worked out that there's a very irrational holding on to things by someone who's got a hoarding issue. So how do you actually work with somebody as a professional organizer if they don't want to let anything go?
I think the first thing that I can do is I try and acknowledge those explanations and that full rationale that they have around their belongings. Like you say, no matter how unreasonable I think it is, or how hugely hindering it is for their life, I have to go at it knowing that this is a construct, if you like, that's allowing this person to stay on top of things, is allowing them to function and stay in control. So, I acknowledge it's part of their full-on anxiety about their life and things that might have happened to them. And so they might sound a bit defensive, they might be a bit abrupt, it might feel like you're wading through mud, if you like, in terms of trying to make some progress. But I think the starting point for me is always trying to say, look, I hear you. I don't, I'm not judging those explanations. I'm hearing what you say. I'll perhaps repeat back to them what those reasons are, and just acknowledge them rather than dismiss them. And that's quite hard to do. Even as a professional organizer and 5 years of experience, I still have situations where you get on the edge of just saying, honestly, the newspapers need to go, but you can't. And I can very much understand why family and friends find it really tricky, because they care more about the person than they do about the items that are being stockpiled. And so it must get very frustrating. But that first starting point, I hear you, I understand what you're saying, the reasons why this and that can't go.
I think that's so right as well. And I think the anxiety that you talk about and the way that affects the way that people work with you, that's true of people who are overwhelmed with clutter as well. So, more so perhaps people who've got a pronounced hoarding issue. But anxiety definitely plays a big part of life with my clients, because ultimately we're pushing people or taking people on a journey out of their comfort zone, really. And that anxiety can be so debilitating and really affect someone's mood and how they interact with you on a day-to-day basis, really. So it's so important to know that whoever you're working with might have those ups and downs and mood swings throughout the day, and that it's nothing personal. Would you agree with that?
I do, and I think you're exactly right that it does cover the full spectrum of working with somebody. And sometimes you can be really surprised. You can be working with somebody and something comes up where people have got big defences around it, and that can take you by surprise. With people who are really sort of pronounced with hoarding, when I have the first session, I expect doors to be closed, not like literally, but like all options to be ruled out. And it's taken me a long time to just get over that as a sort of problem solving kind of person as you would be as a professional organizer. Not to go, well, why haven't you tried this, or why haven't you tried this, or it's just to expect that they have their reasons, they're going to close the doors, and just if you stay on side with them, there is going to be an opportunity because they've often approached you or they're ready to make a change for some reason. So just to be patient and to be kind, kindness, acceptance and humour and a sense of personal connection. Yeah. They are going to go a long way to build trust. If somebody who wants to they really want to retain control more than your sort of more average client, they absolutely would be terrified at the idea of losing control. But it's tricky work for sure.
So we've got to this point. So can you give us a specific example of where you've been asked to step in? I think a lot of your work is referred by agencies, isn't it? A lot of my hoarding work that I've done in the past is private clients or people that are coming to me directly, which sometimes is a little bit easier because they then made the decision that they want to change for themselves rather than that being forced onto them by a third party. Not that with the best of intentions, of course it is, but it's a very different psychological feeling, isn't it, when you've made that decision for yourself. So because a lot of your work is referred by fire service or social services, can you give any examples of where you've done that and worked in a home?
Yeah, so we've had many cases where we've perhaps been called in because there's no clear route from the lounge to the kitchen, for example, and items are stockpiled downstairs. The chances are items have been significantly stockpiled upstairs. It is more common than not, if it's a full home, that the person's actually sleeping downstairs. So they are bringing their clothes down because that's where they're getting dressed and doing everything. So it's normally the housing officer's gone in, they've seen it's really full. I don't know, it's not safe around the fire, although they perhaps are not even using the fire, but it's making their tenancy start to be at risk. So with housing officers, with their visits, when they have their electrical checks in council housing, that might flag up a problem that the electricians and plumbers, and for example, weren't able to gain access. So we get called in to perhaps start working with the tenant to making their throughways better. I mean, they don't call us in, obviously, we're not clearance, we're not going to magic away what's there, but to start to work with the person on starting to make things a little bit safer in their home. We recently had a lovely case where we've been working with somebody who couldn't be discharged from hospital. So you're working with the hospital discharge team, mental health case, so mental health ward, and the gentleman in question had a pronounced issue over a number of years. But the fundamental difference was obviously explaining to the agencies that yes, the person does have to be involved. So have to go and collect the person from hospital, and they have to work with us. We don't make the decisions for him.
I think it's understanding, isn't it, Jasmine? And you make a very valid point there. A lot of people, and particularly because of the hoarding, the TV programs that have been on about hoarding, a lot of people will jump automatically to the conclusion that we're going to just clear and chuck everything in a skip and not work sensitively through things. And that's really important. And that's why people are so scared to ask for help, because that someone's going to take over and make them make decisions that they don't want to make. Absolutely right. They reckon of that sort of potentially 2% of the population that suffer with really pronounced hoarding disorder. So that's where they absolutely have swapped quality of life for stockpiling belongings, and they really feel anxious about letting them go. Of that 2%, only 5% are known to support agencies. So there's very few people coming forward. And the most important thing, no matter how people have come to me, whether that's been their physiotherapist that's recommended, they make the contact, whether it's the housing officer, or sometimes we do get private calls, because this lady, she wasn't able to get her central heating addressed. She knows that's the imperative. The most important thing for me is that's a huge step they've made. Most hoarding goes completely hidden. And if you think of the risk those people are potentially in their homes, that's quite significant. And the most important thing that I'd want to sort of relay is it's hugely important that they've made that step, and that now they are on that route, they need to be treated with respect and dignity, and where possible, they retain control over what happens to their belongings. It's so useful now here down in Devon to be, and I know it's happening across the country, which is fantastic, is to be recognised as a service that is useful before things get to absolute crisis level. And for me, that's really helpful. Before people are unable to make decisions because structurally something's happened to the house, or there's been, something has happened in the home that's led to there only being a fast-paced clearance option, which is going to be deeply traumatic for them. Of course it is. So, honestly, we've talked so much about trust and how important that is. Trust and respect, I think, isn't it, of people's belongings. So once you've made that leap, when you've actually started working with someone, how do you get them to believe that you're not just going to throw everything away when they're not looking?
Yeah, it's really important. I mean, that's, I think I know when I'm in a home where, I was today, for example, I've worked with somebody whose home was very full, but they left me to fill bin bags in the other room while they were working with somebody else, and they were not about to check the bags or anything. She trusts me. I have been working for a while. She trusts me to put things in the bag. But with somebody with hoarding disorder, you pick things up from the floor and you have to present it out in your hand for them to pick out what's useful and what's not useful. You have to find where it slows the process right down, of course, but you must keep doing it no matter how frustrating it might seem. The process is more important than the outcome, and that's hard for me sometimes because I've been tasked by social services to show results from the time that I'm there. But I think if I don't keep them on the side of that process, if I don't show that I'm not just putting things in bin bags and they're not looking, if I don't keep asking, checking, okay, you're absolutely closing this door to me that we can't look through the books, you're absolutely sure? So recently, you exploring those areas. If they give you a blank and they say no, then you move on to something else. You respect that. I mean, I say that I worked with a lady and her daughter recently, and it was the first session that I worked with her, and it was a council referral. And I said to her right from the outset, I'm going to make mistakes today because I don't know you well enough yet. I'm going to ask the questions that you're going to be saying, absolutely, I'm not going to do that. But I said, I've got to ask, and you tell me, and I will listen. But let me try certain things out and stay comfortable. And it always feels like a harsher sort of session. But she knows that I'm treating her like an adult, so the interaction is adult to adult, as opposed to I've stormed in like mum who's telling a child to tidy up their room. So it's keeping that non-judgmental tone, asking, checking, and man, you've got to be quite clever about making spaces when people don't want to make spaces. So it's finding any avenues of possible flexibility and say, right, let's see what we can do here, even if it's kind of just right. This first session, we're going to organize things. We're not looking to you to let go of anything. We're just going to make your belongings more accessible to you. So keeping it nice and positive as opposed to a big stick. You've got to do this because otherwise your housing officer is going to escalate the issue. So keeping it nice and positive for them.
Yeah, definitely. So it's kind of working on and focusing on progress rather than the amounts of stuff that's going out, I guess. And then ultimately then they can keep control and know that that's moved on in the way that they wanted it to. Absolutely right. I mean,
when I say look at the different avenues with this particular household recently, I might ask, so what's the cupboard like at the back? What's that got in it? And the lady said, oh, there's books in there. Some I want to keep, and I'm hearing the word some. That's like, she said, some I want to keep. That's a real win, because, if she said, right, all of those I need to keep, I gotta respect that she said that, but all of those, there's no point even opening the cupboard. She said, oh, some of them I want to keep.
And I think that is a breakthrough, Jasmine, because people who are not necessarily got hoarding issues tend to view books as a complete collection, so quite often we'll definitely get a kind of don't touch my books at all. So rather than seeing them as individual items like everything else, they very much see them as a complete collection, and so that is an untouchable collection. So I know when I'm working with clients, I have to sort of push people a little bit more to maybe look at them on an individual basis, and then once we get going, a lot of them will go naturally, but people have that resistance at first because they're so special. And that can be the case. Books, it is for a lot of people. It can be shoes for some people. It can be clothes, etc. Whatever it is. It can be toys for some people too, kids' toys and things. So no, it's really important that you talk about books, and that must be incredibly hard for someone who is a hoarder.
Absolutely right. And I think, don't get me wrong, I think she meant in that particular situation, I think she meant some I want to keep and some I want to sell, or there was something else she wanted to happen very specific, and in that, so right, let's look through the cupboard, pull out the ones, because it's right at the back there, the ones you want to sell, let's get those out so you've got chance to sell them. So honouring the fact that she wants to do something particular, but actually when she started to look through, there were some that she was happy to let go. There was a specific charity that she wanted to support with them. And I did have to check each of the books individually, make sure she hadn't put things in it. It's a much more careful, protracted process. But importantly, as I focused for her, she knew she had the books the way that she wanted to keep, identified some she wanted to sell, and two or three bags are going out for charity, which there was no expectation for me, and I leave the bags there, so there's no expectation. But if you know that there's some books, and it's just making it's okay if nothing goes in the bag today, first session. But actually I was really pleased, because it was difficult for her, but she wasn't being forced, and that's the important thing.
Yeah, it's just making some progress, isn't it? And positive progress in that day, because it's hard, isn't it? Because you have to keep the momentum going. You have to motivate people forward by making progress. But you've got to find that balance, I guess, to make it happen. So why are people hoarding? So where does that come from?
Well, I think it's important for me to say right from the outset, I don't always get to the bottom of it. I'm not there really to psychoanalyze them. I'm there to help them with their belongings. I don't always really get to the bottom, but there are plenty of academic papers that examine the sort of, triggers of trauma and deprivation to starting this cycle of relying on acquiring stuff to make you feel better and in control in what would feel to them as an otherwise sort of crazy, chaotic and ungiving world. So there's plenty written on that. But in my experience, my clients that hoard, they have a deep sense that the world out there is not going to look after them, that they are on their own and they need to protect themselves. And that might be something recent they allude to. Sometimes people have said, I've been broken into, and I can see that they've stockpiled things right up against the front and back door. But actually, if they're hoarding as well, chances are that they were highly anxious before that. So yeah, they have this sort of sense where the world out there is not going to look after them, and purchasing of items has become a coping strategy for that intense anxiety. But yeah, don't always get to the bottom of what the trigger has been, but certainly try to focus on the here and now, really.
It's about drawing a line under it, really, isn't it? And trying to move forward. Obviously, the psychological side of it is more important, perhaps, than with people with hoarding issues, because it is going to need some kind of psychological involvement. But, it's interesting that you talk about deprivation and trauma, really. So those are, in my experience, those are the two things. And it's often not just one trauma. It's often trauma after trauma after trauma. And sometimes when you hear the stories and the things that people have had to go through in their lives, you don't know how they're even getting out of bed in the day. Do you know
Absolutely.
what I mean?
And for some people who are hoarding, that trauma, it feels like it happened yesterday to them. I just think you are right. Those there are people who've had all sorts of really terrible things, and sometimes they will share those with you. And in my experience, those people are really in a really difficult situation. It's as fresh today, that trauma, as it was 10 years ago or whatever. It feels really all encompassing, and so that makes it really difficult. People would find, then it's more understandable, isn't it? People will find some way in which they're going to try and get through the day, and seize some control over a world that's kind of made these horrible things happen to them. It's
because there's a thought process, isn't there, that stuff is never going to let you down. It's going to be there. You've got control over buying it. You've got control over where you store it and put it and look at it and so on. And so it's just that stuff's not going to let you down in the same way that perhaps people or circumstances have in the past.
Absolutely. And that sort of self-soothing. We all know what it's like to, want a glass of wine after a long week as a sense of a coping strategy. But we can't know what it's like unless we've lived it, or we've had a family member to know what it's like to be an alcoholic. And so I think in the same way, I kind of think of it the same way with hoarding, is that we all know what it's like to self-soothe with going and buying something and getting that dopamine hit, that kind of feel-good brain hit of, oh, I've treated myself, you know, I deserve something, and self-soothing. We know what that feels like, but we can't understand then what it's like to have it as such a pronounced issue for us that, you know, we go into homes where there are literally hundreds, if not nearly thousands of carrier bags of things that have been purchased as a self-soothing coping strategy that clearly is now out of control. And that's the difference, I think, between hoarding and just collecting a bit too much stuff because we, you know, and self-soothing in that way. It's become much more compulsive, I suppose I would say.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that the general public are less accepting perhaps of hoarding disorder than alcohol or drug misuse, because that's very much in the headlines and people tend to have come across people that have suffered from that. Yeah. But hoarding disorder is still quite hidden. People are quite secretive about it and people don't understand it as well and judge it quite harshly in general. A lot of people, don't they? So we've got a long way to go to sort of address that and get over it. But it has got much better, hasn't it, in the past, you know, with the things with the social services getting involved and waiting before, like you said before, it gets to crisis points and so on. So people are waking up to the fact that this needs to properly be addressed and that people need to be treated appropriately to get through that.
Absolutely. And I think because hoarding can go hand in hand with self-neglect, and because, you know, if somebody's neglecting themselves, you know, houses can be a little bit unkept is how I'm going to say it, but you know, even on the television there's sort of, it becomes a bit voyeuristic, or the sense of squalor in a home, and some people say, I can't understand how people would live like that, and though it looks like a choice, it isn't a choice. Like I said right at the start, that those people have chosen a way, but it's far more personally painful to them to live differently than it is to face up to that full pelt of the anxiety that they're feeling. So it's, I suppose, when you start explaining to people their own sort of inclinations, so, you know, and how they can spiral out of control. So, you know, my mother-in-law would say, oh, you know, I always used to have, you know, a pencil would be really special when I was younger, and so when we moved her, when she moved house, she said, oh, I don't want you to judge me, but you know, I've got a whole load of a whole box full of those special pencils. I'm going to be like one of your clients, you know. And I said, well, you know, she knows what it's like to have something special and to collect it, not irrationally. I mean, she's got a massive box full of pencils. But I said, the difference is, if you had so many pencils, you couldn't help but collect them, and then you couldn't get into your own bed because you had so many pencils. That's where my clients get to. And I think then that tips it from, you know, being something that's not to poke fun, and she wasn't poking fun, but something very unusual and kind of otherworldly, to kind of actually that a bit of sympathy to have got out of control in that way.
And it's really important to make that distinction, I think, isn't it? And there are so many people who kind of maybe flippantly sometimes will call themselves a hoarder. Yeah. You know, and that's just a kind of term that's become quite jokey, I think, for some people as well, isn't it? So, so do your clients always tell you why then? I think we've alluded to that. So I think you've said that sometimes they will share and sometimes they won't share. And it's not always entirely, it's not that it's irrelevant, because of course it's not irrelevant, but it's not always necessary to achieve success in the decluttering process, is it? Because it is about that kind of drawing a line under things and moving forward.
Absolutely. I mean, I don't press them. I mean, I think I try and stay on task with them about what it is that they want to achieve themselves. So we're like, you know, alongside each other on the project. I'm not trying to probe them for information about why this has started as it is. And I sometimes have to be very clear in my sort of aims and objectives for support agencies. They're like, well, you know, did you get to the bottom of, you know, and no, I'm working with them on creating a bit more three-way space. What I am working with them on is, you know, if this has become, hoarding has become very much an integral part of their identity and place in the world, then I can only work with them and try and find what's going to work for them in that time and place. And also, like a lot of decluttering, I suppose, for them to experience, it's a bit like behavioural therapy, like phobia therapy. They get exposed to the thing that frightens them the most in a kind of safe environment, and going through their belongings is what frightens them the most. The fear of it just being got rid of is what frightens them the most. Making decisions sometimes is what frightens them the most. And they've been in that environment, it's not been as bad as they thought, they've survived it, and they'll let you in next week. For me, that's a massive progress, and that's why I need to sort of make sure I relay to agencies and to family members and things like that. That is a good point of call. You don't have these sort of breakthrough moments where suddenly there's a reflection, and it may be too complicated for them to ever understand where that compulsion's come from. Where there's rarely that breakthrough moment. It's because of this that I do this, and then it all goes away. I mean, I don't know if anyone has ever experienced that. It's just about each day making some sort of sense. I'm gaining control back on my life, and actually it's all right. I'm still all right in all that. So that's what I hope for them anyway.
Yeah, definitely. So there are going to be people then listening to this podcast who have might know that they've got hoarding disorder themselves, or they've got a loved one, and they're absolutely scared to death about what might happen if someone comes into their home to tackle the clutter. Have you got any, so you've talked a lot about your clients and small amounts of progress. Can you talk about any success stories?
Yeah, I can. I mean, obviously, as any sort of reflective practitioner, I know right in the front of my mind the ones where it didn't work and they weren't ready, and I do wonder how they've got on. 2 years later, I drive past houses and it's even more significant sort of outside of their property, and I always feel quite sad that that's it. We've not got a better option for them, and chances are it's going to escalate for clearance to be an only option, for example. But the success working in a home of somebody at Hoarding is small stuff that really sticks in your mind. It may not be as conclusive as you get from the TV programs where, there's a team of people, the person's volunteered to be, I know none of my clients would ever agree to being on TV, but there's skips outside that have been agreed to. It's a large project stuff. For me, when I'm working with somebody one-on-one who it's taken them a lot to get to the stage where you're in their home, it's those small things that have happened for them that's really stuck in my mind. So, we've avoided eviction for householders. We know we've been there and got to a situation where it's been de-escalated and the person's able to stay in their home rather than what really terrifies them, which is being moved without their say-so. We've allowed people to come home from a hospital. We recently worked with a gentleman. It sticks to my mind because he was unable to go home after a spell in mental health ward in hospital. His home was so full and inaccessible, and thankfully the hospital had heard about us and asked us to work with him. He'd had years of mental health issues, and he was ready to work with us. He had really no option, and he wanted to go home. So we did this work with him. We conducted short 30-minute bursts with him of one category of belongings, let him have a break for some food, and then did another 30 minutes, kept it as straightforward for him as possible. We made sure he was comfortable. We honoured his options for waste or charitable donation. We helped him recycle what we could. We even helped him sell a couple of items. We stayed on side basically and had this sort of mantra with him that if you are unsure, then keep. So you'd say, well, what about this item? And so, well, if you're unsure, then keep. And in that environment, he filled loads of our blue bags of charitable donations, and things were coming out of his home, be it that he found the process really personally difficult. And he was in a safe place with us. And we enjoyed working with him. We really saw trust build over the the 4 sessions that we were funded for. And recently we've been back to do some small scale work with him, and we stood in his kitchen, and he put the radio on and made us a cup of tea.
Oh,
And
that's brilliant.
it's a huge deal, because a month ago he couldn't get into his kitchen, and through his work, it's not clearance, his work with us, supporting him, facilitating and fast tracking the decisions he was ready to make, he's got some pride back in his home, and pride back, some dignity back for himself as well. And so it isn't full scale. Have we finished in his home? No, we haven't finished in his home. Is he going to have some difficulties when he tries to find it? It's going to be a little bit, there's going to be moments where he's going to go, I think that's probably gone out. I'm not saying it's perfect process, but that moment of him having some, being able to make himself a cup of tea, those are the sort of progress points for people whose homes have been just inaccessible, and they found the process so difficult that you really take a lot of pride in.
Oh, it's such a lovely story, that, and so nice to be able to be part of that as well, isn't it? To be, instrumental in making that happen. Mm. So as part of our podcast series, we always try and let someone have some takeaways, really, some actions they might do. So what would you say to someone listening to this podcast who is hoarding, knows someone who is hoarding? Have you got any words of advice for them?
Yeah, I mean, if they are the person who's hoarding, then I'd say, 5 years of working in this sort of situation, I uniquely appreciate that they've taken a really important first brave step in acknowledging it in some way. They're clearly thinking about it, clearly thinking, how do I address this, even if it's at a tentative stage, because they've signed into this podcast, they're involved in, researching and finding out more about what they can do with their belongings and decluttering. So I'd say, well done. That's a really important step to have taken to get to this point. The other thing I'd say is, have you spoken to your GP? It's a really big anxiety issue that's going on there for you. And so, some people have got involvement with their GP to do with anxiety. Does the GP really fully understand how it's having an effect on your home? Because that's perhaps worth having a conversation about. And for some, they've not approached their GP at all. They've kind of managed themselves. But if you feel like you are hoarding to the point where you are now, it's becoming really a pronounced issue for you and your household, it's worth having a conversation with the GP, I would say.
Yeah, I think you're definitely going to need support and involvement from the medical profession in some way, but I think sometimes it's easier said than done, because I think some GPs are definitely more understanding than others. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, it is, and things are changing a little as it's being recognised that hoarding is it's a medical issue. Hoarding disorder is a medical issue. It affects the brain so much that it's something that does need medical intervention. So it is starting to change, where it's been taken as not just a sort of lifestyle choice, which I hear a lot, of course, and that's starting to change. People recognise that this is something that's very different. So, obviously you've got to trust your GP, but it's worth having that conversation with them. Sometimes I get involved in writing letters for them to take to their GPs, explaining what the sort of the hold is that that anxiety is having over them, and how their hoarding's affecting them. The other thing I would say is, beyond the GP, to try and find someone to help you. This might seem really frightening because some people have not had somebody in their home to see how full their homes become, for example, potentially because of hoarding, or because they're worried about people being judgmental or starting to move things around. But it is simply going to be too much for you to do on your own. Your hoarding compulsions will fight tooth and nail to keep you stuck as you are, and change takes great energy and can feel painful, so you do need somebody alongside you. it's, if you're feeling like you need to make changes now, finding somebody fairly soon is really important, so you can stay on top of things and keep sort of safe living going on as long as possible. Try not to put it off, really. But you do need a trusted person, someone who's not going to sort of wrestle control from you and treat you like a naughty child. We've mentioned before, it is difficult for close friends and family not to become overwhelmed in the process, because they care more about you than they do about the things that are around you. But that takes a bit of understanding. I suppose that's what I'd say to people who are friends and family is, if you go in too fast trying to make changes because you're doing it for their well-being and they are hoarding, you're dismantling the very constructs that are keeping that person safe and well psychologically. So just to remember that as you're going into the process. But finding someone to support is really important.
I think that's a really important message. So the person who hoards and the person who is doing the hoarding and their family or friends are looking at the situation from two completely different perspectives. They care more for you and your well-being, and you care more for your belongings. And that's where there's this sort of dilemma, isn't there? And there's always going to be this wrestling between the two, really. So it doesn't necessarily need to be a professional that you call in to help, but it's got to be someone who understands it and is willing to work with you, with your needs and your psychology, really, isn't it?
Yeah, you need somebody patient. And I think, being really upfront about that dilemma that you're both in, that some people, you're tackling a room, it feels like a project, you're both on it from the same viewpoint, but this is going to be different. Acknowledging, like you say, that you're coming at it from different avenues, it's just going to allow you to treat with humour and respect the times when you're not going to get it quite right for each other without being annoyed. So somebody says, no, I'm not opening that box, and the other person, the family member, wants them to open that box, that's when the tension's going to come. All these things need to go, I don't want those things to go. But knowing that they're going to come up against those feelings is going to help. I think as well is understanding that there will be some wins that will leave you both feeling okay. So, the family member, the friend is going to be able to make things a bit safer, little small steps, and be happy to be engaged in the process. And the person who's living in that household with the belongings to sort through is going to be feeling okay. But you need to find those wins that are going to make you happy. There might be things that you're not so attached to, for example, spaces where things can be stored better without difficult decisions. Just starting to do that process without going straight in with all the difficult decisions and a big push. Just start, really gently. And like I say, both acknowledge that, that you might trip over each other a little bit, literally, but you might trip over each other in your different approaches. But just to know that it's okay to then ease off and come back at it another day.
I think that's right. I mean, when I've worked with people who have got hoarding disorder, there does tend to be something in the house that they're happy to tackle without it being too distressing. And it's very much got to be done in a phased approach. I mean, I've got clients that I've worked with for over 8 years now, and I still work with them every sort of 6-8 weeks. And it's probably never, ever going to be a normal, in inverted commas, home, which other people would consider to be a normal home. But their homes are a very, very different place than they were 8 years ago. And I know, and they know, that they've made colossal progress. But, even in the home that I'm talking about, there are some things that are still off limits, but there are a lot of things that are not. And, because I know the crux of where the problem is, and that's not going to be tackled yet. So we'll still keep working on that and make small steps towards that.
Absolutely. And I think, if you've worked long term with somebody, there are things that they found problematic to start with that they are starting to even look at and address. And I think that's significant progress. But that's why the patience, whoever's working with you, needs to have that patience to be mindful that you're not going to magic it all away. That's not what the person wants. It's actually just to make things manageable, and importantly, that they are staying in control of the process. So it can be long-term work. And it's one of those things that we face, that we don't necessarily get long-term public funding. So people if they're working with a professional organizer, need to be ready for us to relay things that they can carry on doing themselves, but it's, small incremental steps are what are going to be required to keep them safe in their home, which is what we're looking for, really safe and okay, and off, not in a situation where their home's at risk, basically.
I think it's so important to get the right person involved, isn't it? Because even, we're professionals and we deal with decision making all the time, and patience is obviously a big part of what we do. But even we sometimes can find it quite frustrating if it's, if progress is very, very slow, and that takes a bit of getting used to for us as professionals. And so someone that's never done that and is not coming into that day after day like we are, it's going to be a learning curve, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I mean, for the person who's hoarding, they need to acknowledge as well that it's they need to use all the tricks they've got in their repertoire for their own brain to keep themselves going, and all sorts of things, making sure, in the same way that if you were tackling any project, make sure they've eaten properly, make sure you're keeping things very time limited for yourself, and you've got this buddy with you, hopefully, that's keeping you motivated and supported on task. But it's realistic to say that you can expect relapse, and I think that helps people take a deep breath and understand, yes, it is a journey, but there are sometimes 2 steps forward and 1 step back. Your mind is not always your friend, and for those that are working with somebody who is hoarding, I think that's important, that it isn't going to go in one trajectory to improvement in their home. Sometimes when things are not going so well for the person, they will relapse to those hoarding habits, those coping mechanisms that have been with them for so long and are a reliable friend when they're anxious. So you do a little, reward themselves, you relax and repeat, but do understand that the bad days will come where you'll slip up and you'll end up coming back with, 6 or 7 carrier bags, or, you're not going to be able to do sorting out that week, that month, perhaps. Expect those times, take a deep breath and be ready to go at it again further down the line. But the thing that I would say right from the outset, if you have the right person involved, it will count for a lot. But the person involved needs to see what's happening for them as a gain, and keep control over what's happening for them. And I would say you're braver than you think, but just to be gentle and kind to yourself, but keep persevering, and things will get better. They will get better.
I think it's really important as well motivation is absolutely critical, isn't it, to this process, and having somebody to help motivate you. I think it's sort of proven really that being part of a community of people with the same goal as you is absolutely essential. I mean, to be honest with you, that's why we've got our Declutter Hub, really, because we've got our Facebook page where there's lots of people on there talking about their decluttering goals, and not everybody on there is going to have hoarding disorder. In fact, not many of them will, but it doesn't mean to say that the processes and the thought process are still the same, really. And so it's important to have that community. We've got a private community within our member site Declutter Hub as well, and I think it's just this kind of old mantra of a problem shared is a problem halved, really. So we've got things in our site that hopefully can help as well. Although for people with hoarding disorder, it is more pronounced, and it probably will need more intervention than just us. We're probably not going to be able to fix that problem overnight, but hopefully there'll be certain snippets of information that people will be able to take and use as practical solutions to things. Wow, Jasmine, that was so fantastic and enlightening and full of insight. You're so skilled at what you're doing and making such a brilliant positive impact on your clients, and I'm sure that's come across to our listeners. I hope our listeners have enjoyed your stories and understand a little bit better now the difference between someone that's overwhelmed with clutter and then someone who actually has sort of tipped over the balance into suffering from hoarding disorder. I've loved chatting to you as always, Jasmine. I know you'll be back on.
It's always a pleasure.
On more podcasts. There's so much more. We've only just scratched the surface of hoarding today, and there's so much more that we can talk about. So thank you so much, Jasmine, and we'll see you next time. Where can people find out a little bit more about you?
Yeah, so you can look at my website, changeyourspace.co.uk. So changeyourspace.co.uk, and I do post up on Instagram. Sometimes very unusual things that I find I put on Instagram for people to guess. Obviously, with the client's permission, I put those up. What you won't find there is lots of homes that are very full. People are very private, but it's quite interesting, I think, to get an insight in the sort of day-to-day life that we have down here in Devon, helping people in their homes. So but have a look in Instagram, but it's changeyourspace.co.uk, and there's some tips and pointers there, and a chance to chat to me some more if you wish.
Oh, thanks, Jasmine. And we'll make sure all those details of all your different social media feeds and website and so on are in the show notes as well. So that's it for today. If you've enjoyed listening, please don't forget to follow us on social media, as well as Jasmine. And if you don't want to miss next week's episode, subscribe to our podcast. Thank you, and see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Declutter Hub podcast. Check out declutterhub.com for more inspiration, and don't forget to tune in next week.